Marshall and Sagar here. Welcome back to the Realignment. We've got a really awesome show for you guys today. We are talking to Douglas Murray. He's a really interesting person from the United Kingdom who's been on Joe Rogan, has released a couple books during this sort of Trump era. So this is another one of those good long-form conversations with a person who's interested in issues beyond just their sphere.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with Douglas. He's such an interesting guy. I interviewed him on Rising about a year ago. And Douglas has always been a really interesting person. He's wrote The Strange Death of Europe back in 2017 about immigration. He's looked and tracked the social justice movement very closely. He is somebody who kind of identifies pathologies and trends a lot sooner than a lot of other people will and then calls them out. So I suspect that Douglas's work will look and be in the mainstream in a couple of years, which means Realignment listeners are very fortunate. I'll give you a straight up trigger warning though. I mean, Douglas is a controversial guy. He's unapologetic for it, and some of you may not like it, but I think you'll be better off having listened to the whole conversation. We definitely press him a little bit.
Yeah, and that's really what makes talking to Douglas worth it, because the conversation I wouldn't be interested in is like generic, like, the social justice warriors are crazy. Like, that conversation was slightly edgy 4 years ago, but it definitely isn't edgy in 2020. But what's good about Douglas is you not only push back against him, but you guys as listeners are going to see him actually think when we push back instead of just giving us a generic response, which is the worst thing to hear. So a lot of good value there.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so make sure you guys give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, and if you feel up to it, write a 5-star review. You can leave us a question within that review. We'll answer your question right here live on the air. Don't feel comfortable with that? No worries. Take a screenshot of your 5-star review. Send in a question to realignmentpod@gmail.com. Okay, Marshall, what is the question for today?
So today's question comes from Darian Marcus. That is the most legitimate nickname we've seen on Apple Podcasts yet. Hope we're not giving away any super personal information here. But the question is, where do you guys want to go with your careers? And have either of you considered running for office? How about you, Sagar? Are you about to announce something today?
Not a chance, Marshall. Not a chance. It's funny. When I was growing up, I was definitely one of those really annoying kids who wanted to run for office. And after I got to DC, I was 18 years old. I was a student at GW and I was an intern. After about like 5 days, I was like, oh, I don't want to do any of this. I was like, I hate everything about this entire Capitol Hill process. And I think that has kind of been an interesting turning point for me, is when I really realized how power, influence, and so much more works in the United States today. I just think so much of it resides in the media space. This is something that I just really love doing. And overall, I think that my impact is way higher in what I currently do relative to my age, prospects, etc., and this podcast and show Rising and so much other stuff that I concern myself with than anything I could ever do in office. So look, where we are right now, talking about the things that we do here on this podcast, not just politics, by the way, business, culture, and so much more. It's all intersecting, because the truth is that politics is downstream from culture. And so I'm kind of looking at the power ladder and thinking, where and how can we be influential and understand where the real power in America lies? What do you think, Marshall?
Yeah, this is embarrassing confession time, but when I was in high school, my yahoo.com email address, that much of a TBT, was actually kozloff2020@yahoo.com. 2020 obviously referring to my then planned congressional run at 28. And in terms of how much I've shifted on things in the past 10 years, I would literally not run for office if I was paid to do so. And that's not like the correct metaphor, but I just wouldn't want to do it. And I think because what's sort of driving the way I've sort of changed my thoughts on political office in these sort of conversations is that I generally do not believe that DC right now is a place where the sort of things that I'm interested are going to sort of happen. Doesn't seem to be a place that's going to prioritize like different ideas. There are everyday votes where, you know, you're going to see hyper political culture war issues basically ravage anything. So the reason why we're not having an interesting conversation about the nature of worker power in 2020 is literally the culture war. So I just don't see how that's a space that people who are interested in these sorts of ideas would want to sort of space. I'm thinking back to a recent book that I was reading about JFK. I mentioned this on Tuesday's show, but in the book, it talks about how in the 1930s, JFK's father told him and his older brother that in the past, during the robber baron era, the place to go was New York and capital to get money and be a businessman. But what was changing in the 1930s with the arrival of the New Deal was that Washington was the center of the action. And that was definitely true for the next 60, 70 years. And what I'm increasingly starting to feel, and this might not be literally true, but it definitely feels personally true, is that the more we get away from DC, so the more we're talking with someone like Bruno, who was, in Portugal, and it sort of has this eclectic sort of knowledge space, the more I'm interested in what the sort of thoughts are. So if you're thinking about why it is that we on the Realignment aren't just talking, just people in the sort of DC track aren't just talking to people who are straight up political, I think you'll understand more where we're coming from, because we're increasingly seeing, if you want to understand how big media works, you shouldn't be talking to a fellow at a think tank. You should talk to Andrew Souls, who is just a Patreon comedian guy. So that's my thought on that part.
Yeah, no, really well said. And with that, as always, a special thank you to the Lincoln Network for sponsoring this podcast, as we always appreciate it. Reboot Conference is coming up. I'm going to be there. Marshall's going to be there. Rachel Bovar and many others, friends of the show. Go to rebootconference.org to learn more. And with that, let's dive in.
Douglas Murray, welcome to the Realignment.
Great pleasure to be with you.
Good to see you, Douglas.
So Douglas, the first thing we want to start with is sort of the very idea of this podcast. It basically came about because 2015, 2016 on both sides of the Atlantic was obviously crazy, to put it ineloquently. You had Brexit, and then you also had the election of Donald Trump. So we were very interested in sort of the idea that the political winds in various ways were shifting. Now, just to open up, I'm curious, how did you think about immediately the world after those two really tectonic events?
That's a very good place to start. Yeah, it was an extraordinary period, and I think to a great extent we haven't absorbed how extraordinary it was. My own view is that a portion, perhaps even up to half of the American public, like the British public, remained in the early stages of the grief process. In my own country, we had the Brexit vote in 2016, where the majority of the public voted to leave the European Union. And then a few months later, we had the extraordinary election of Donald Trump in America. Both of these things were so unexpected, not by the majorities of the public, but by the vast majority of the class that we might call the elite classes in journalism, in the media, the elite classes within government, and much more. These people were genuinely amazed. They thought that the British and American publics had done something outrageous. They had voted for one of the two options offered to them, and it was the wrong option. They weren't meant to do this. It was something they had been told not to do. Didn't they know the facts? Didn't they know how wrong this was? And so at least a half of the population, or up to half of the population in both countries, who were on the losing side of this, and I'm not saying that to taunt them, it's just the fact, the portion of the losing side got stuck in the early stages of grief. The early stages of grief include denial and bartering. You cannot believe that the thing has happened that grieves you so much, and you try to stop it from being the case. And in America in particular, you have got stuck, a portion of America has got stuck in recent years in that stage of the grief process. It should by now, as in the UK, and I think it's slightly better in the UK now because we are leaving the European Union, although for a time it was in up for grabs as to whether we would. A portion of the public in Britain have started to be able to move past those stages of grief to the most important one, which is acceptance. But it seems to me that in America, a significant portion, particularly, as I say, of the people that we might call the elites, I don't like the term very much myself, but it exists in some form in each of these sectors. A sector of the elite has never got to the acceptance process. And this is terrible for a democracy because, sometimes you have to lose. Otherwise, it's not a democracy. It's not a two-party system. And there are all sorts of criticisms that can be made, of course, but to not accept the vote, to believe that your fellow countrymen have done something totally reprehensible, which you need to correct them over, is simply terrible for democracy. And I think it's one of the reasons why the last 4 years have been so extraordinarily bitter.
So just a quick follow-up here. I think what's fascinating to compare the British and the American examples is the difference in the structures, however. So we're talking about majorities and democracy. I know the US isn't literally a democracy in that whole democratic republic idea. But in Brexit, at least, wasn't it 52-48 vote? But in the US, we had, and this is part of what drives the grief, you have the popular vote versus the electoral college, right? So there's this weird intermixing of, I think that just adds to sort of your framework, and that adds to a lot of the dissatisfaction with the American system that many people, not just in the elite, have. So how do you think about that dynamic?
Well, but we've been here before. We've been here before in my own lifetime. I mean, you remember the election of 2000. Right. The election of 2000, we had the same thing. For 4 years, George W. Bush was accused of effectively not being the president by his opponents. Now, there's all sorts of criticisms you can make about the system, but it is the system you have. As long as you have the electoral college, there will be times when one side can make the claim that somebody hasn't won the popular vote, and another occasion the other side will make the same claim. But it is the system you have. And there is something profoundly anti-democracy about people saying, the vote has happened in the system we have, but we've decided, because it didn't deliver us the verdict we would like on this occasion, that the system doesn't mean what it means. And that, and again, we had it with George W. Bush. He's not my president. And we've had it with Donald Trump. He's not my president. Well, sorry, he is. You may not favor him as the president, but he is your president. And I'm afraid that the tricks, and I do see it as being that, the tricks that have been pulled in the last 4 years on the president of the United States are very similar to the tricks that have been pulled on the people of the United Kingdom who voted for Brexit. It's a playbook. I wrote about this in National Review. It's a playbook that is very uncannily mirrored. In Britain and in the US, we've had it in exactly the same order. The first thing is the claim that the public were wrong, that the public were evil, that the public were motivated by bad intent, that the public are racist, that the public are homophobic, that the public are misogynist. Then we have the claim that the public were misled. They didn't know what they were doing. They were being racist and homophobic and misogynist, but they were being manipulated by the Russians, for instance. We get the claim, we had it in Britain, then you had it in America, that the Russians had literally tampered with the votes. Then that's shown not to be remotely viable as a claim. And so they say, well, they may not have manipulated the votes themselves at the polling stations, but they used bots and they got into the minds of the voters and they manipulated our minds and they played around with us. And they've been through all of these things. Then we had, the big data stuff. It was all to do with Cambridge Analytica.
Right.
It was all to do with Robert Mercer. Literally the same companies, the same people have been accused of being behind both of these things. All of these claims, one by one, have fallen apart. And I deeply, deeply regret all of this because of the opportunity cost it has been for America. The opportunity cost was the same in my country. To have 4 years in which large portions of your ruling class, in fact, in Britain, the majority of people in the last parliament actively want to undo a public vote, is desperately sad and a desperate situation for democracy to be in. And it's the same in America. I don't know how you can overstate the calamity of a political class warring to undo or delegitimize a democratic vote.
Right.
As I say, you have to move past these stages of denial and bartering to a stage of acceptance. Often elections have gone the way that I wouldn't have them go, but that's the deal. You have to lose sometimes. And part of being a grown-up democracy and a grown-up Democrat, as it were, with a small d within that system, is accepting that fact. And too many people simply haven't been able to accept it.
Couldn't agree with you more, Douglas. I mean, I think the interesting thing here is both the contemptuousness, which the ruling class will look at voters, but also the invention of theorems and so many other things as to why exactly these idiots have been fooled into doing something which is in their objective self-interest. This is where I want to connect it actually to a little bit in your book and the rise and the construction of postmodern thought. So what is that connective tissue between a Russiagate, a contemptuous against working class Americans, branding them in a certain way, to the architecture and construction of an ideology? You can call it wokeness, postmodernism, social justice, whatever you would like. And that becoming what Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology. And I think that's a very important a term, because it means it is to succeed the small d democracy that you just discussed.
Well, you can take it in the process and the progress that's occurred in the Democratic Party in our own recent lifetimes. I happen to be gay myself. It's not a very important part of my identity, and it's not a character trait, as it were, I have any interest in, people analyzing me through. But gay marriage used to be a very fringe thing that was being pushed for. It was fringe, by the way, even within gay movements that remain in America. Up to 10 years ago, it was very unusual for a politician in America to be in favor of gay marriage. Barack Obama wasn't in favor of gay marriage. Joe Biden wasn't in favor of gay marriage. Yet within just a decade, you have this situation where anybody who wasn't in favor of gay marriage 10 years ago, as long as they are somebody you want to attack, is attacked as a totally reprehensible figure. We actually have people, Joy Behar, for instance, I think it was, who almost had a career crash a couple of years ago. And it turned out that 10 years earlier, she'd written something saying she wasn't supportive of gay marriage. The point is, these things have been moving extraordinarily fast. And I don't mind all sorts of right. I happen to be in favor of the right in question. But when rights move this fast, when ideas move this fast, they have to be weighed up, not least by a form of understanding of where you were until yesterday. And the ideology that leans this heavily on, again, I put this in brackets in a way, but gay rights, women's rights, LGBTQI rights, race and anti-racism in particular. Now, the thing that's lent on this is hard in recent years is fundamentally misunderstanding the current nature of American society. And I believe has been misrepresenting the very recent past. It's been pretending that the ideas we hold in 2020, many of which are very fine ideas, were always the case. It's pretending that all of these developments that have been going on were ones which, if you didn't have them until yesterday, you are an illegitimate actor. And it uses this in a very specific way. As I say, if you are a Democrat or a Labour Party politician in the UK and you weren't totally on board with some of these things until yesterday, you get forgiven for it. If you're on the right and you weren't on board with all of these things till yesterday, my gosh, do they come for you. There's an obvious example that's sometimes wheeled out. It's a bit of a talking point among Republicans. I don't particularly favor it, of the extent to which, Joe Biden famously, eulogized somebody who'd been a member of the KKK. Now, right. I don't think that's because Joe Biden supports the KKK at all. I think it's a demonstration of the fact that there used to be an understanding of the complexity of the way in which things had moved in our own century. And yes, that things were getting better, but that we had to have an understanding of the terrible nature of parts of the past and the need to move on and the need to be forgiving. Now, if Donald Trump had given a eulogy to somebody who had been a member of the KKK, that extension of understanding would not have occurred. And this is what worries me. It's not the things themselves. It's the fact that they are weaponized against specific groups of people. So that at this stage, left-wing activists in America believe that their job is to persuade people that America is the most racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, sexist, patriarchal, unfair, unequal society in history. And they are actually campaigning on this set of claims. And I think that they are misleading people, because they're misleading people not just about the American present, but about the American past. They are offering a wildly reductive and simplistic version of America as their prevailing ideology.
So, Douglas, let me put on the hat of, we have a lot of leftist listeners too, and they would say you're downplaying our past flirtations with racism, the power structures in our society which have kept marginalized people down, and that many of these understandings that you're talking about were essentially functions of white supremacy and, of homophobia and many of these other things, which I think everybody here thinks is despicable. So what is and look, I'm revealing my personal bias here. I want to live in an egalitarian society in which there is an understanding between the elite class, the working class, and elsewhere, because that's what balance in a 300 million person democracy looks like. I don't think we're there yet. So what would you say to those people who hold that mindset? And how would you tell them that, hey, there are going to be people in this country who you may even find them morally reprehensible, but they are just as equal citizens to you?
Yes, I mean, that's an absolutely key thing. You have to regard your fellow citizens as citizens. You cannot turn them, in whatever way around you do it, you can't turn them into just reprehensible, undealable with people. And I worry, but I have to say, my own observation, you can tell I'm from the United Kingdom. I'm a visitor in this country, and I'm also a great admirer of this country. But it has been my experience throughout my life that the right is as guilty in America as the left of playing identity issues. The right certainly has been able to play questions, culture war questions against the left, just as much as the left has against the right. And there has been, in my view, dehumanizing in every direction. There can be no doubt about that. I'm very keen that people realize two things. First of all, I completely agree with you, and it's very important to state, I stated at the opening of the Madness of Crowds, every single one of the rights issues I'm talking about starts not only in a good place, but an exceptionally admirable place. Every single one of these cases, every single one of these issues, however, has at some point fulfilled the famous quote of Erich Hoffer, who said, 80 years ago now, said, every good cause begins as a good cause, becomes a business, and degenerates into a racket. Mm. At this stage, there is a racket in each of the rights claims. There are legacy organizations whose interest is to present the situation in America as worse than it is for their own sectional interests, their own pension rights interests, their own healthcare rights interests, and much more. But the second thing I want to say is, what we should be trying to do, everybody of good faith from all sides should be trying to do, is accurately define where we are in America and accurately define what the problems are that we still need to address. Now, here's, if I may say so, one way of doing that. I say in the Madness of Crowds, what if we could agree on a certain definition and indeed objective? And here's one I'll throw out that I'd like to think that your left and right wing listeners, or your centrist, or your I'd rather stay at home and not do anything, whatever it is, listeners could agree on. And I think it would be this. I think we could agree on the following proposition: that nobody should be held back from what they can achieve in their life because of a characteristic over which they have no say. That is, no woman should ever be held back from a position of responsibility or power or prominence because she happens to be a woman. Nobody should be held back from achieving what they can achieve because of the color of their skin. And nobody should be stopped from achieving what they might achieve in their lives because of their sexual orientation. I take all of these things as completely red. They are my aspiration, they're my desire, and they're not just my desire. I believe and recognize that they are the best way to have the most successful society imaginable. There is no way that a society can fulfill its potential if it holds down people because of a chance and a fluke of birth. There's no way that a society can achieve its potential if, in the case of women, 50% of the population are actually held down from achieving what they can achieve in their life, or 13% of the population who happen to be black are held down, or whatever small percentage, maybe 2-3% of the population happen to be gay. This is against the interests of everybody in society. So, what is one of the problems that we've been going through in recent years? Firstly, I would say it's a misdiagnosis by a portion of the left about what the right as a whole wish for. I don't deny, by the way, there are people on the right, as there are on the left, who don't wish for what I've just suggested.
Right.
I think they are I think the polling, among other things, shows they are a remarkably small percentage of the American population. But the vast majority of the right, as with the left, believes in the aspiration I just laid out. So here's the thing. Here's a serious thing for us to contend with. How do we ensure, first of all, that we get to that situation that I described, if we're not already there? And we may not be there in every sector. I think we are in a lot of sectors, but we may not be in every sector. And secondly, how, once that terrain is found, caught, captured, you might say, do we make sure that the terrain is held? That is, that there isn't a time at which that spirals back and those opportunities are no longer available. Now, I think that is one of the biggest questions of our time. It's one of the real challenges that our society is trying to go through. And the left has a set of answers to it. The left in America in particular has a set of answers. The answers include, though are not limited to, quota systems based on race, quota systems based on sexuality, and quota systems based on gender. This isn't just, by the way, I'm never particularly keen on these things being a university-centered thing because, you know, most people don't go to university, and I think that to a great extent, the university argument can derail much of the rest of the argument. But take it in a case like the recent legislation passed in California. The recent legislation passed in California to do with board representation mandates that in order to have a company making money in California, you have to have quotas on your boards from, quote, underrepresented groups. This, by the way, has to ramp up. So I think by next year, if you've got a board of 5, 2 people have to be from the list of underrepresented groups, which includes trans people and Pacific Islanders. The number goes up depending if you've got a 9-person board or above. By 2022, you've got to have a larger representation in both these cases. Now, people in California, and I'm being, you know, as charitable and understanding as I can be on this, the legislation passed in California would appear to be an attempt to improve board representation from underrepresented groups in California. This is a left-wing answer to the problem of underrepresentation in certain sectors of American life. And it's one that much of the right disagrees with. And what is the right's answer to it? Broadly speaking, the right's answer is to say, you don't need to legislate to make this happen. If you have the right circumstances in society in terms of educational opportunity and much more, it'll happen anyway. It'll happen naturally. This is the real contest that is going on in our society. And yet it's one we almost never identify because it's always had on this crock basis of, for instance, it's good people versus Nazis, or good, well-meaning people versus people who want to repress women. And this is not going to solve any of the remaining questions we have to answer. And I'm desperately trying to call for people to have the meaningful conversation. Otherwise, we will only divide each other further and never get to that meeting point.
Yeah.
Well, let's have, I don't want to even say have the debate, but when I think of this argument over natural change versus sort of top-down change, obviously the civil rights movement and the debates in the 60s are not on the same moral level as board representation, right? I think there's nuance to the California debate that I don't think is valid in the case of the Jim Crow South. However, if we look at that debate over natural versus forced top-down change, a lot of conservatives, I think, not to their credit from the long-term perspective, such as Barry Goldwater, for example, believe that, look, I'm not a racist. Barry Goldwater, you know, he desegregated his family's stores back in Arizona when he was younger, but he believed that you cannot force top-down change. You should enable these things to go away over time. That, I think, was a view that was incredibly naive given the nature of what was happening in the South. But the broader point that I'm getting to is, how do we value then and weigh the natural versus the forced? Because it's simply just, I think the lesson of the civil rights movement is actually you can force change in certain circumstances in ways that conservatives in the 60s and 50s undercounted. So how do you think about that on a broader level?
This is a very important point. Now, I don't like thinking of these things too much in right-left binaries. I mean, we have a little bit. I've done it, too much myself. I'm responsible for it here, but I don't like thinking these things entirely in left-right binaries. I think it's part of the problem. But to do it once more, there is an interpretation of this which sees, as it were, the left as having been in favor of civil rights and the right not in favor of civil rights. I think this is a misunderstanding of history, but it's quite a common one. And it's certainly fair to say that elements of the left were more vocal, more involved in each of the rights movements that I'm talking about in the madness of crowds than they were on the right. Now, this actually, we call it a right-left debate because there's a serious debate that actually is going on, not just in us as a society between two different camps or anything like that, but in each one of us. See, I think that the left-right divide is to a great extent better understood by seeing it as being something that we all have within us. That is, on the political stage, to take, as I say, the simplified binary situation, the left proposes changes, often radical changes to society, and the right acts as a restraining force on the worst of those claims. So the left comes up with a set of things saying, for instance, we don't have enough equality in our society, and the right says, hang on a minute, when you say equality, what type of equality are we talking about? Are we talking about equality under the law? Okay, in the end, we will agree on that. But we're not talking, for instance, about seeking a nirvana in which we have equity. That is, that everybody comes out with exactly the same prizes at the end of the whole process. Now, that's a meaningful debate. Not because you're on one side or the other, but all of us to some extent are on both. By the way, we have this all in our lives and we all know it. This is why I wish we could have a better conversation than, well, having a good conversation now, but that we're having a better conversation than we're having mainly in America these days. Everybody knows in our own lives the pull between the things that we would like, including things that are right, and the restraining force that pulls us back. Neither on their own works. If you just identified things you want and took them, a lot would go wrong in your own life. If you only had the restraining impulse that said, don't do the thing that you want to do, that itself would be a thwarted and unpleasant life. All of us, from whether we choose to eat too much or drink too much or smoke too much or whatever it is, know the debate that goes on within us is between the thing that we want and the restraining impulse of what is wise for us to do. And I think something similar exists in the political realm. Now, in rights terms, in the late 20th century, the left did an extraordinary amount of good, because you are completely right. It was the left primarily, not solely, but the left primarily, that said there are inequalities in American life that are intolerable and we must address them. And that happened in each of these cases, and it happened particularly in the 1960s, and it happened in the decades that followed. The question, however, that we contend with now is, as you say, first of all, is it correct to see the remaining struggles as in any way needing to be fought over with the vociferousness and indeed the passion that those earlier struggles were fought over? I would say not. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be fought over, but we shouldn't be pretending that the enemy is exactly what the enemy was then. Mm-hmm. And then we have this secondary impulse of, are there restraining things that we need to come in? Now, I would say, for instance, there are obviously restraining instincts that need to come in about some of the claims being made at the moment. I think the worst way to make sure that we get to the situation that I laid out as one we could agree on is to say, for instance, that all members of one racial group, and I wouldn't like this whatever way round it was played, are to be held responsible for historical sins and seen as being uniquely evil as a result of them. I think it's the worst imaginable way to arrive at the kind of equality that I think we all do actually desire. In the same way that if you actually desire to have the situation that ensures that women are never held back from what they can achieve because they happen to be women, the worst way you can get there is to decide that the other sex, the other side of the species, the other half of humanity is intrinsically wicked or particularly belligerent even. To try to advance women by demeaning men is as unwise as to try to make sure that racial equality happens by demeaning and defaming white people. And we can have the same one, by the way. It's not as common and it's more of a minority thing. But you do see the same thing happening in the elements of the gay rights movements. There are elements of it that are not content with equality, but wish to present all straight people, all heterosexual people, which is the overwhelming majority of the population, as in some way wildly bigoted still about gay people. And the stats don't bear it out. Mm-hmm. Year on year, on each of these rights issues, the American public shifted. And it shifted for lots of very interesting reasons, which we could learn a lot from. But it isn't fair in 2020 to present the situation as if we were in pre-legalization gay times, as if we're in Jim Crow times in relation to race relations, and as if women in America live in a Margaret Atwood novel. You know, none of it is fair. And I just add one other thing to that, which is that, as you know, in The Madness of Crowds, I use at the opening a metaphor that I take from the late Australian philosopher Ken Minogue, who said in the 1960s in a book of his, The Liberal Mind, that there was a problem that liberalism, in both senses, or all senses of the term, you might say, can find itself in. And Minogue said in the 60s, there is a problem within liberalism of what he called St. George in retirement syndrome. That is, that liberalism in the campaigning sense, which, as I say, has many good things to be said for it, but liberalism in the campaigning sense that sees life and purpose as being found in fighting against dragons, slaying the dragon of oppression, may find itself having a problem. And his extraordinary perception on this is something I pick up and run with in The Madness of Crowds, where I say the civil rights fight in the 1960s was a real dragon slaying. I would argue that the consequence of the Stonewall Inn or onwards was a real dragon slaying by the gay community. I think that legislation that needed to be passed in the first and second waves of feminism was a real dragon slaying. The demand for the vote for women, the demand for equal rights, including property rights for women. These were real dragons to slay. But here's the problem, as Minogue identified, and we're now in this situation. St. George, having got all of the claim for having slain the dragon, and justified a claim for having slain the dragon, may find himself in a difficult situation. Wishing to keep getting that acclaim, the St. George figure who slayed the dragon may find himself going around the land looking for more dragons to slay. Right. And finding too few dragons, may find himself swinging his sword at ever smaller beasts, until eventually one day St. George can be found swinging his sword at thin air. Now, some people say to me, Douglas, we are not in a situation yet where we are swinging the sword of social justice and much more at thin air. There are not imaginary things entirely out there. But I say, at the very least, they're not dragons anymore. They are smaller and smaller beasts year on year. And again, left, right, centrist, we could at least agree on that. And one of the oddities of the situation in America, in particular in recent years, is, and I say this in The Madness of Crowds, the extent to which after these battles are won, the wannabe dragon slayers, who would have loved to have been with Martin Luther King and the March on Washington, who would have loved to have been with the Stonewall Inn, who would have loved to have been with the suffragettes, find themselves weirdly arguing more vociferously, unpleasantly, than the people who are fighting the real fights. I say this in The Madness of Crowd. To read a hugely celebrated black writer today like Ta-Nehisi Coates is to read somebody who writes more angrily about America than James Baldwin did when there were many, many more things to be angry about. What Ta-Nehisi Coates lays out in the 2010s of the situation in America is more unforgiving than what James Baldwin was writing about in the 1950s. And it's the same in each of these issues. to hear fourth wave feminists talk about the patriarchy, they say things that the suffragettes would never have said. The suffragettes wouldn't have got anywhere if they'd have used the fourth wave feminist slogans like kill all men. I think the suffragettes wouldn't have been able to warm very many men to their cause if they'd have gone around with that on their placards. So there's a very strange situation that we're in, where people at the better situation, I don't yet say at the ideal situation, but at the better situation, talk as if the situation has never been worse. And in this, I think we find much of the deranging tone of our time. There are all sorts of criticisms, for instance, to make of Donald Trump. I could reel them all off. We all could. I think very few people would say that he was the most admirable person in terms of personal characteristics and traits, whatever he's achieved in his life. However, all of that aside, it seems to me wildly inaccurate to pretend that, for instance, the president, I'm not a supporter of his, but I'm just an observer of this. It seems to me wildly inaccurate to pretend that the president is, for instance, a wild homophobe, or that he's an anti-Semite, or that he's a racist, or that he hates women. I mean, well, there's a sort of jokey way you could do this. I mean, I actually think that if anything, he's, much more pro-gay than most presidents. I think he's probably, apart from anything else, in favor of gays because he thinks it opens up the field for women. There's less competition. I think he genuinely has a positive attitude towards women. He's obviously, somebody who likes women in lots of ways. But I don't think you could claim is this sort of somebody who wants to institute a Margaret Atwood dystopia. And I think in racial terms, we're in similar terrain. I don't think we're dealing with somebody who's actually got all of the reprehensible traits of all the other things you can say about him, has the reprehensible traits in question. And I worry deeply about the consequence of telling people that is the situation that you're in America with your president at the moment.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying, Marshall.
No problem. A couple things. So firstly, to audience advocate for sort of what a liberal would say to that. They could say, yes, I concede your point. Donald Trump, there's documentary evidence of this, is very comfortable with gay people. However, if you look at the consequences of Donald Trump, for example, the people he would nominate for the Supreme Court, I don't know if you saw this, but for example, recently, two conservative justices on the court said that they believed the Obergefell gay marriage decision was incorrectly decided. So if I'm a liberal, I could say, look, on a personal level, I can reasonably accept the idea that Donald Trump is very comfortable with gay people on a personal level. But if we actually look at the consequences of his decisions, they would have an adverse policy decision that I would sort of dispute. And then sort of my second point here, and this is, I'm not quite sure I agree with this, but it sort of came to mind on your point about the sort of tone that people are taking on these civil rights issues today. What they would probably say is James Baldwin, maybe not James Baldwin specifically, but Black writers and activists in the 50s and 60s were quiet and restrained because they feared death. Right? Because they literally feared that, in Mississippi or the Deep South, they would be lynched. A suffragette would fear, hypothetically, as some suffragettes were, that they could be killed. And the accomplishment of these movements, beyond just the legislative changes we're talking about, is that we now are safe to be as angry as we want without suffering the consequences. So I'm not quite sure I know exactly how I feel about that, but what's your response to those two dynamics?
That's a very interesting point. I mean, I'd push back on it a little. I think there is something very revealing about people's attitude when they don't actually want to invite people to agree with them. When you say all men are trash or kill all men, it strikes me you're not trying to find people to agree with you. You're trying to divide. In the same way, if you say that white people in America are systemically racist and much more, it seems to me you're not really trying to invite them over into some agreed territory. You're trying to divide. And I think that this tendency you correctly identify as being a tendency in the past in suffragettes, say black writers in the 50s and so on, you could argue it. I think in a way that I mean, the suffragettes did all sorts of things, which were certainly very forceful. I mean, some of them were willing to give their lives for the cause that they were arguing for. But I think that there is a grace in the argument, certainly of the most prominent and admirable figures in the civil rights movement, which to shrug off, or indeed to say that it was simply because they were fearful, I don't think is quite accurate. I think the grace of Martin Luther King didn't come because he was fearful. I think he was one of the least fearful people in human history. I think what he knew, one of the great moral insights of King, is the recognition that there needed to be people coming over to his side, which is what he did. He and the movement in the 60s won because of the moral force of their argument. It was morally impossible to oppose it in the end. Now, that is the position that anyone, it seems to me, would want to be in if they were getting people over to their side. And that isn't what is going on at the moment. And just to return to the first part of the first point you make, I agree. There are liberal friends of mine in America who've made exactly this point to me. There are several answers to it. One is, I think people have to be very careful about trying to guess too many moves in advance in the chess game.
Everyone's been very guilty of that these past 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, everybody can do it, and it's a very tricky game to engage in. And I would say this. First of all, I mean, by the way, I say in the gay chapter and I say in the trans chapter in the Manners of Crowds that the LGBT bit, I said this ahead of Dave Chappelle, I might add, by the way. I said the LGBT bit of the alphabet doesn't add together. It's actually different things going on here, and I'm very wary about connecting them all. But the main argument against Donald Trump in gay rights terms in recent years has been the claim that he's anti-LGBTQIA. There are now more letters in that alphabet than there are in the alphabet. But the LGBTQ campaign has mainly been against Trump because of, for instance, the ban on trans people in the military. Now, I say several things to that. I believe the trans argument has been maintained by the LGBTQ leadership, and they don't speak for most gay people in America. I believe it's been continued by elements of the self-appointed leadership of that community because they want something to do, because most of the other things have been dealt with. I'm not saying there's no homophobia in society, but in terms of rights and rights enjoyed in America, there's almost nothing left to do unless you get onto the trans issue. And I say and explain in the Manners of Crowds why the trans issue is quite unlike all the other bits of LGB. That is, LGB is unlike T. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat trans people with respect, but the trans question, and I say this in the last chapter of the Manners of Crowds, is a very, very little known question. It's one of the most maddening things about the age in America, that so many people talk about the T bit as if we know anything very much about it, and we don't. I've interviewed so many people who identify as T or have identified as T. We know almost nothing about it. Now, I say, by the way, that T does exist, trans does exist. We don't know very much about it, but we do know, among other things, that there is a massive overspill of the T issue. We get, for instance, people who are encouraged to identify as trans and may not be. 80 to 85% of people who identify as having, or identified as having gender dysphoria in childhood turn out to be perfectly happy, healthy heterosexuals or homosexuals in adulthood. They aren't trans. And so this is a complex area. And I think that when people say, how dare Donald Trump say that trans people shouldn't be in the military? They shouldn't pretend that we know very much about this or that it's quite as straightforward as all of that. And, I'm personally for anybody who wants to serve in the armed forces and has the courage and the dedication to put themselves forward for that life to be able to do so. But I don't think that if there is a meaningful debate about that within the army, within the chiefs of the army, and within the president and his advisors, I don't think that that means that gay people in America as a whole find themselves in a situation that's remotely similar to the position they found themselves in historically. And I think the claim otherwise deranges people and makes people behave in this terrible and reprehensible way that so many people are behaving in. Because, if we did live in America, in a society that was actually prejudiced against people because of the color of their skin, we were actually in Jim Crow days, if we were actually in pre-Stonewall days, if we were in days where the Margaret Atwood dystopia was about to be instituted, then we would be fighting with this ugliness and this rancid tone that has taken over in America of late. But if you realize that we aren't, and you can just de-escalate, then we could actually address the remaining issues that are there to be addressed. And as I say, I worry that the tone and the content of the argument on each of these things suggests we're meeting people who are not interested in solving these things, but dividing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Douglas. One thing I actually want to get with you too is something I want to connect the rest of the conversation to something you said back. You almost characterize the right and the left in an almost William F. Buckley sort of way. Like the left is for moving forward. Buckley characterizes conservatism as standing athwart history and yelling stop. That's kind of something we've questioned quite vociferously here on the podcast. And I think what you put forward was that like the left is saying go forward and the right is saying actually let things naturally come about. It almost seems like a fundamentally libertarian critique. In a way, or a libertarian solution. Whereas I have posited, and I think Marshall would generally agree too, is that a lot of these sorts of questions can be addressed through policy action, but by looking at class, by looking at representation, and by thinking within a class framework that we can actually redress many of the problems that are identified here in terms of actual power distribution towards a more equitable society, because I think that's where that cleavage works. How do you see the European and American right talking about class in this particular way? It's a very new phenomenon, but to bring it back to the very beginning, it's basically the break of 2015.
That's that's a very important thing you just opened up. The intersectionalists, who I critique in The Madness of Crowds, the intersectionalists have always had a problem with class. They haven't known what to do with it. And I'm not surprised that they've left it so unaddressed, because it's with the system that they've set up, as totalistic and holistic as they present it as being, the class thing runs right through at an angle. One of the things that I say at one point in The Madness of Crowds is, if you play the intersectional game, including the representation game, on the terms of the intersectionalists, you actually may get yourself to a situation where all you've done is create a new hierarchy. I suspect all of us can do this on a personal level, as well as using the relevant stats. But on the personal level, I suspect we all know something like the following truth. A university, a company, a school, a board, a trade union seeks to get better representation on the intersectional terms. They decide that they need more people of the underrepresented groups. And they reach out and they get, for instance, a woman who is just beneath the level in question, may well be about to be promoted at some point anyway, and has gone through a very good education, had great opportunities, and may well indeed have become from a very privileged background. So you can get to the situation I describe in my own country as the Black Old Etonian issue, where a company or some other entity wishes to improve Black representation, and it reaches out, and among the first people it finds are Black men who have, for instance, gone to a school like Eton, a very privileged school, a very successful, great school, and may well themselves have come from a very privileged background. Now, I give these examples for the following reason. If you have done that, if you have, for instance, slightly advantaged a Black man or a woman in this position, have you actually addressed issues of, for instance, inequality or underrepresentation? Well, you have in one way. You have in one way, or you may have done in one way, but you've also created a new hierarchy, a new type of class. Now, one of the things, and this is a great problem for the intersectionalists, and this is why, as I say, they never address it. One of the problems here is that you end up in a situation where you have a privileged educational class, sometimes as well a privileged financial class, that looks diverse but doesn't take into account economic inequality, economic underrepresentation of people from working class backgrounds. All you've done is create a new hierarchy, and what you don't have is any class mobility and any class variety and any class diversity. And one of the other problems you get from this is that you have the risk that you will lose what we might call ideas diversity. Because what's likely to happen in the scenario I've just laid out, and I've seen it very many times, is that you get this situation where everybody in the company, in the school or elsewhere, thinks the same way about the same issues because they've had similar experiences. On the face of it, they may be very multiracial. They may be very diverse in sexual orientation terms. There may be exactly 50% of women, but everybody thinks the same because they've been through similar situations. Now, the intersectionalists don't know what to do about this because the class issue cuts across it all. And so they've parked it for the time being. But I think it's one of the most fundamental challenges to their whole system. What if all you're doing is creating a new hierarchy, all of which has the same views? And I really have yet to read or hear from the intersectionalists an answer to this very big question. And I think it goes back to where we started. It is one of the primary challenges in America today. It's one of the reasons why there is a class of person in America that is actually quite racially diverse, quite varied in other ways as well, that doesn't think that half of the population is right and doesn't know how to talk to them. And by the way, very quick example of that, if I may. I say this in The Madness of Crowds. This is why we have the weird thing of people being thrown out of their character group if they think the wrong things. So the gay tech billionaire Peter Thiel is allegedly not gay, according to Advocate magazine, the main gay legacy publication in America. He's described as in no way gay by Advocate magazine when he comes out for Donald Trump. When Kanye West comes out for Donald Trump, albeit before then running for the presidency himself, in a vague way, I think. Anyhow, before
that's a whole other episode.
And that's even messier and harder to understand than the intersectionalists. But when Kanye comes out, as a sort of Republican in favor of Trump, he's denounced in the Atlantic magazine as no longer black. And the great feminist, Germaine Greer, when she says, I'm not on board with all of the trans stuff, is said to be no longer a feminist. And this is all a great giveaway. And I'm very worried about this, in particular in America, because your character traits, your racial background, your sexual orientation, your sex, should not in any way ever be a signifier of your political views. And the people primarily saying that it should be, regrettably, are on the left today in America. And I think it is, on the left's own terms, a highly regressive thing to say that that person's skin color tells me what their politics should be. That person's sexual orientation tells me how they vote. That person's gender or sex tells me everything I need to know about what cross they put where on the ballot paper. I loathe this. I think it's reductive of us as human beings. I think it's deeply stultifying. I think it reduces what we're capable of. I think it reduces what we're capable of individually as well as a country. And I deeply, deeply desire the left and the right in America to move past this reductive attempt to limit our potential as human beings.
So, for our last question here, and this has been something that anyone who's listened to this season can tell we've been sort of struggling with. So, we started this conversation with this idea that 2015 and 2016 represented in different ways majoritarian rebuttals to the sort of pre 2015 order on a sort of bipartisan and also nonpartisan sort of level. Yet, all of those sort of cataclysmic and sort of big changes led to a situation where a couple weeks out from the American election, it looks as if the sort of Biden restoration project, after swiftly defeating the forces of like the rising left, it also looks like Biden's about to, womp President Trump. Obviously, the polls could change, but that's what it looks like things are sort of going. So, how, given everything we've talked about, given the fact that the sort of rising woke cohorts that you've sort of spoken about in this episode are so against it, how did all of this energy lead to a Biden or a presumptive Biden restoration? It doesn't really make any sense. And I'm curious what you think about that dynamic.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I have no magical insight into the bewildering American election, and I think, like a lot of people, it could go any way. I know a lot of Trump supporters are saying, "Well, the polls were off in 2016, so they may be off now." I don't know about that. I mean, the polls are very clear at the moment for a Biden victory. Well, I would just say this: whatever happens, I think that the last 4 years have been an enormous opportunity cost in American society. And the opportunity cost is this, and there is a similarity to my own country with the Brexit vote, as you said at the beginning. Mm-hmm. The most important thing that should happen when you lose is you try to work out why you lost. In my own country, the people who lost the Brexit argument pretended that it was because of the Russians or because of bigotry or much more. And they failed to take into account that the British people for decades had simply been less and less enamored of a more and more political process that the European Union became. They just didn't like it. And they thought the arguments for greater union were not that persuasive. And so they voted as they did. If I was a pro-EU figure in Britain or any other country, I would really want to learn from that and change the direction, the system, or the behavior of the entity I supported in order to keep it surviving. I think a similar problem has happened in America, which is that if you were somebody who opposed President Trump in 2016 and couldn't believe he had become president, why did you not spend the next 4 years trying to work out legitimately why the American people voted for him in 2016? Not because of Russian bots, not because of interference, not because of gerrymandering, not because the American people thought that Donald Trump was the most admirable and moral and decent person they'd ever come across. Not that he wasn't somebody who had character flaws that the public weren't aware of, but that the public saw all of the same things that those people who hated Trump saw, that they saw it all as well, and that they could list the same flaws as anyone else, perhaps better than anyone else, and they voted for him anyway. What's the lesson you could draw from that? What are the lessons you could draw from that? They seem to me to be almost endless. You could certainly learn something from it. You could learn what the things were that didn't go so great in the previous administrations. By the way, can I just say, there's a memory here of something that the Republicans and others failed to do in recent years with a memory of their own. When the Republicans lost in 2008, and when they lost again in 2012, there were things they simply didn't learn.
Yes.
They seemed to think, for instance, that, oh, well, it'll come around again, or the American people will just come around to our point of view. When Donald Trump became isolationist in foreign policy, a lot of foreign policy hawks, some of whom I know, said things that were extraordinary. And they didn't realize that perhaps Donald Trump was onto something when he said the American people are fed up of sending their troops abroad to fight in wars that they don't win. That's something that the Republicans and foreign policy hawks could have learned something from. Very few did. So we're all able to not learn lessons. I simply think that for the good of the American Republic, more people after 2016 should have tried to contend with the real reasons why Donald Trump had been elected. Joe Biden may win this election, and if he does, there will be all sorts of recriminations that will occur from the Democrats to the Republicans, and my gosh, within the Republican Party to the Republicans. But I think that most important is the lesson that comes from saying, how really did it happen? What were the legitimate reasons that so many people voted for Trump in spite of all of these things we know about? What are the problems with American hegemony in the world being lost and indeed replaced to China? Are we losing jobs to China? What does it mean to people in huge swathes of America when that happens? Are the American public right to fear that they're not listened to? Was there something in it when they seized this very low tool to make themselves heard on a national and international level? I think there is so much to learn. And I just wish, whatever happens, that lesson could finally be learned, and that people moved past the bargaining and denial of recent years to the acceptance that the American people in 2016 sent an extraordinary message. Whether it's sent again this year or not, that lesson has to be absorbed for this country to be able to move forward in the way that we all know it can.
Yeah, I think it's very, very well said, Douglas, and we couldn't agree more. So thank you so much for joining our podcast. We just appreciate your insights so much. Madness of Crowds, recommend everybody go out there and buy the book. Thanks again, Douglas.
It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
It's great. Thanks.
Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. As always, be sure to do the following. Share this podcast with your friends, family, coworkers, whoever you think would get a kick out of this. Be sure to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And if you want to ask us a question, email us at realignmentpod@gmail.com or leave us a 5-star written review with the question in it. Now, I want to say you guys have been sending in so many questions. We're not answering as many of them as we can, so we definitely have a huge mass Q&A episode coming down the line soon, and keep them coming.
As always, a special thank you to our sponsor, the Lincoln Network, for sponsoring this podcast and enabling the work that we do here, and we will see you guys next week.